Welcome everyone to our development dialogue on post-COVID and industrial policy. Our dialogue is based on research that we did, and part of the research that TIPS had done, and we joined by a former TIPS researcher who's moved on. I think to greener things because he's wearing green, but we looked at this issue because we saw the world was changing and changing in a way that meant that industrial policy that we had conceptualized, even a decade and a half ago has changed. We are looking at quite a number of things that have happened, since, there was the COVID pandemic, which a lot came with the COVID pandemic. There was supply chain disruptions. We've had global conflicts. Some people are already saying that, what does World War III look like? So there's a lot of big changes that are happening in the world around global tension and all that happens and impacts on the trade environment, in the industrial development environment. And part of what we've seen as part of these changing dynamics has been a shift. So we've seen world trade, which was already on the decline from 2008, and we've got some slides that we can share around this, but we've seen a decline in world trade. And, there was a bit of pickup after COVID, but we're not back where we were, and that has implications for industrial policy. We've also seen massive issues around climate change. So it's not just something that we're worried about. We're seeing climate change impacts. You just need to open the newspapers on any given day, and things that have never happened or happened 100 years ago are happening, and not just once. There's more frequency. Desert cities being flooded with years full of rain in less than a day. Lots of dramatic weather events across the planet. So we're seeing the impacts of climate change, but we're also seeing the global responses to the need to do something differently in response to climate change. So that has implications for how we think about industrial development, how we think about sustainable development, and how we think about the viability of continuing on the same path that we've been on. And that, no doubt, has also impacted on some of the trade dynamics. We've also seen, specific to South Africa, that South Africa has trailed its peers, particularly since 2020, but even going back further, since the global financial crisis, we haven't grown as fast as our peers in upper middle income countries, and we haven't seen that rebound on the GDP growth since COVID. So we also, worryingly, have not seen anything close to a rebound in investment levels since COVID, which then impacts on our GDP growth. And again, we've got some slides on that which we can share. And it's something we need to think about in terms of South Africa's own approach to industrial policy with those kind of investment levels. And also employment, where we're getting close to pre-COVID levels, but it means that we've lost out on a lot. So our rebound hasn't been quite as rapid and as strong as it should have been, and compared to our peers in other upper middle income countries. So these are some of the things that we've had to think about. And importantly, as an economy that was historically mining dependent. And so in the 1990s, we saw a shift to, possibly getting away from this mining dependency. We saw growth in autos, and in recent years, we've seen growth in horticulture. But in the last couple of years, we've seen that we're still very dependent on minerals exports. So what does that mean for the structure of the economy? So with all of these dynamics, we thought, okay, let's look at doing some useful research that's going to provide this evidence base and help us to rethink about where we're going with industrial policy. So today we're sharing these insights. We've got a great panel. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm Saul from TIPS, and our panel is we've got, in order of who will be speaking, we've got Nishal Rob, who's an economist at TIPS, who's going to talk about his paper on the South African economic trends pre and post COVID-19 and some of the implications for industrial policy. We've got Itumeleng Mokoena, who is now a DNA green researcher. No, he's just wearing green, but I won't let you live that down, sorry. But he was a researcher at I know. He was a researcher at TIPS, and he's moved to DNA economics. We brought him back for today's discussion to talk about his paper on trends in global political economy and trade. And then we've got another economist, a senior economist at TIPS, Nokwanda Maseko, who's going to talk about her paper on the climate crisis. And then our last speaker will be Niva Makhetla, who's got a long experience in research and in government, who's going to present some of her insights on the political economic context for industrial policy. We then have, as a discussant, I don't know if you're going to be able to discuss and to be a discussant for everything, but as much as you want to share your insights, is Tanya van Meerlis, who heads the policy unit at COSATU and has spent various time in Department of Trade and Industry and the Economic Development Department as elsewhere. So we've got a great panel. We're looking forward to a really nice discussion, and we've budgeted 2 hours for the discussion today. So we're going to go until 4 o'clock. And we want to have at least half an hour for inputs from people in the room, for people online, so that we can have people's insights as to what's going on in this changing industrial policy landscape. And part of what I often say when I chair the development dialogues, we've got people presenting their research, but the experts are also around the table. So we're looking forward to people sharing their own insights on these very important topics and how we can better understand industrial policy going forward and some of where it does need to be going forward. With that, let me hand over to our first presenter, Nishal.
Okay, here we go. Afternoon, everyone, and just want to make sure the presentation is good. Maybe someone online can confirm that we're good, but I'll continue so long. So this is the title of the paper, South African Economic Trends Pre and Post COVID-19 and the implications for industrial policy. And I guess this is kind of a framing input for the discussion to come, and my colleagues, I think, will get more into the detail of some of the new and emerging challenges facing the country and the implications of those for industrial policy. This presentation will focus broadly on growth, investment, and employment. We're going to try and identify areas of change and then areas of continuity as well in South Africa's economic structure as a result of the various trends. And then, turn the discussion to what the COVID-19 shock looked like and then what the recovery has been subsequent. And then a short discussion of the implications afterward. Okay, so this, and just a warning up front, this is essentially going to be a whole lot of charts. I hope I can keep your attention. Wish me luck. The first one is, so if we could possibly move that top thing, that would be great. Thanks so much. Okay, so this first chart is on GDP per capita. It compares South Africa to our upper middle income country peers, excluding China, which, as we all know, is exceptional and totally throws out the data. It creates a whole bunch of extra work to take it out. And the idea of showing you this chart is just to illustrate the kind of long-term view, which we think illustrates some of the structural nature of South Africa's economic development challenges, as well as the fact that since about the mid-70s, the norm has been for the South African economy to be in stagnation and decline, and that's been more the case than periods of growth have been. And what I'll illustrate a bit later is that the one period of relatively rapid growth for South Africa in this period was during the commodity boom of the 2000s, and for various reasons we think it's unlikely that that's going to repeat itself, and we need to kind of think about if we can't rely and hope for another commodity boom, what needs to be done to get the economy growing again, to get the country back on a path to becoming wealthier, being able to provide more for its citizens, more opportunities, more social provision, etc. I think the other striking thing to me about this chart is the extent to which South Africa was outstripping its upper middle income country peers, and then the way that then around the late 80s shifted positions, and then toward essentially from the global financial crisis onwards, there's been a gap opening up. And if you look toward the end, you can see the impact, you can see the immediate impact of COVID, and you can also see that the recovery in these countries has been on a better trajectory than ours. So that by way of some contextual data. Maybe Rizal, if you could switch it, that would be great. Okay, if you switch it again, there was just two arrows there to illustrate slightly different, bit of a crude arrows there to illustrate the trajectories. This is a chart of GDP growth comparing averages from 1990 to 99, 2000 to 2009, 2010 to 2015, 2016 to 2019, that immediate pre-COVID period, and then the recovery between 2020 and 2022. And yeah, the trajectory there is clear as well in these averages, that and I think serves to illustrate again the relatively exceptional growth that we had during the commodity boom period, and then how that fell off quite rapidly, and then the extent of the difficulty of the recovery that you see between 2020 and 2022. And the other thing is that, again, compared to our upper middle income country peers, in fact, even during that exceptional period of growth, our growth was on average less rapid than the upper middle income country peers, and then the decline has been more stark subsequent. And if you could click twice, Rizal, you'll see those arrows as well. Now the next, okay, so the next one I think hopefully makes the point about the link between the dependence of the South African economy still to this day on various commodities. And you can see in this area that's outlined there in red, that the one exceptional period of growth in South Africa was totally corresponded with this exceptional rise in commodity prices, and if you take this graph back to I think 1960 as the data goes, you can see that it's relatively flat. It really was an exceptional kind of world historic event for commodity prices to have increased that rapidly to that extent, and for for up to just over a decade, I guess. And you can also then see the volatility subsequent. You can see in the immediate aftermath of COVID, due to supply chain constraints during to the end of lockdowns, you can see a kind of another spike in the prices, but then they've started to come down quite rapidly as well. Particularly in the case of coal, you can see the solid black line represents the coal price, and I mean the difficulty is, in the good times, this creates some interesting and positive outcomes for South Africa, but in general, this kind of feed through from export earnings to export revenue to our kind of fiscal state, through to then investment, through to growth. It's been volatile since the end of that commodity boom period, and it's not something that one can plan for. I mean, in general, the understanding is that period was driven by the entry of China into the world economy, their exceptional achievements in that period, and that's it's not clear that that can happen again, a kind of a global impact to that extent. I mean, many other large developing countries who may yet have exceptional periods of growth, but again, it's not something that as economists, as policymakers, we can predict and really plan for, I think. So, yeah, I think hopefully this illustrates some of the problematics of the structure of the economy. I also would like you to note the shape of this commodity price chart, particularly from 2000 onwards. You see again the kind of big uptick and then a period of volatility, and then again another uptick around the COVID period. And just I'd like you to note how closely this mirrors this chart of South Africa's export earnings. I'll get into the composition of this chart, which is a slightly ugly one, unfortunately. But I think just a starting point is to see that between 2000 and, you see a big fall as a result of the global financial crisis, but then you see basically through to around 2012, 2013, that exceptional period of commodity price growth, and then the subsequent fall off, and then another spike around the COVID recovery period. Now then onto the composition of this graph. What this illustrates is South Africa's top 10 exported products according to kind of 4-digit HS code. And again, the striking thing about, this illustrates very clearly. In our top 10 exports, there's only two products, goods vehicles and passenger vehicles, that are properly downstream diversified kind of manufacturing. The rest are either minerals or kind of not particularly highly processed and value added commodities. And you can see that this kind of dashed line that you see going across is the percentage of total exports that this group takes up. And you can see that by the end, I think it's around 51%. The year before, in 2022, it was up to, I think, around 54. So there's an exceptional dominance of these products in our export structure. You can possibly see it a bit better in this graph, which is, this is current dollars, this is constant. And you can see how these kind of spikes in export revenue are quite exceptional. And also not, I don't have a graph to illustrate this, but not necessarily matched by increased physical production. This is essentially purely an outcome of prices. So on from there, my clicker's struggling again, I'm afraid. Thanks for that. So then onto manufacturing. And this doesn't include all of those products that were in the export basket, the top 10 exports before, but this illustrates, this is an index where 2019 is 100, and this kind of illustrates the trajectory of the physical volume of manufacturing production in South Africa. It's not all the manufacturing subsectors, but it's a few of the large and important ones. And there's some striking trends here. You see in particular the clothing, textiles, footwear, and leather sector physical production has, really suffered from 2000 onwards. And then following on from 2019, it hasn't yet recovered its 2019 level. And in fact, in fact, transport equipment is the only one of these manufacturing sectors, and that's autos essentially, that is currently producing on a physical volume basis more product than it was in 2019. And this kind of illustrates the difficulty. We're not just dealing with COVID, we're dealing with, in South Africa, with a whole range of other challenges. And this just illustrates that there's been a long-term decline in several of these important sectors, and that the recovery has been relatively weak. Now, onto investment, and again, if you can recall the shape of that export chart, you can see that matches the solid black line represents South Africa's gross fixed capital formation as a percentage of GDP. And you can see that, again, between 2000 and 2010, 2011, 2012, there was a a pretty impressive rise in that the proportion of fixed investment in the economy, but then you see the very rapid fall off after that. So where export revenues didn't fall to the same extent, the investment has fallen off, which indicates that a lot of the large, most important firms in the economy that ideally would be driving investment have not necessarily come to the party for various reasons. You can see that again in 2019, the kind of very rapid fall in trajectory due to the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns, the associated policies, but you can also see that this is a longer term trajectory. And that really since the global financial crisis and since the end of the commodity boom, South Africa hasn't been able to find a solution really to some of these structural issues, and that we're falling, again, the gap between us and the upper middle income countries is widening. I mean, China, we don't even, it's hard to even talk about. You can see how exceptional their rates of investment are, which, may end up causing them some problems, but I think we'd probably rather be in that situation than our current one. And then, some of the outcomes of this kind of period of depressed investment, you can see in particular, I mean, it's similar for mining, but also for manufacturing, that the fixed capital stock, which is this chart here from 2015 to with the years following the COVID pandemic, the capital stock has really declined. And what this means, this is essentially a reflection of firms not necessarily investing in new technologies and new plants and upgrading their processes. And that's not good for our competitiveness, not good for our efficiency. It's not good for facing all the serious challenges that we have to face, for example, the energy transition. If we're going to be able to socially pull off big transitions like that and face big challenges like the ones we're facing, you need your real economy sectors to be investing. And that's, something we've yet to find a solution for. If someone could give me like a 2-minute warning, that would be great. Otherwise, I'm going to run over. It's probably not. Okay. I'll wrap it up in 2 minutes then. So this, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this just illustrates the kind of, again, there's the structural changes. When, again, at the beginning, we're talking about where have been the changes and where have been the continuities in South Africa's economy and in its structure in particular. And this chart, which is of the percentage of total gross value added in the economy, shows, if you look at the dashed line that's right at the top on the left, that's manufacturing value added as of 1994. And you can see that its importance, its place in the economy has declined substantially. I mean, there's lots of debate about what that means for development in the current era, whether manufacturing is as important as it was, what are the prospects for continuing development and becoming a richer country through growth of services and other sectors. And maybe we can get into some of that later, but it is an important fact to recognize that manufacturing's contribution to overall value added has fallen substantially, and it is a problem. Whether or not it's the most urgent problem, it certainly is. It is one. I'm going to go very quickly now through employment, which is quite a big area to run through quickly, but this chart essentially just shows that, again, employment by sector, if you look at manufacturing in particular, between 2003 and 2023, and this is formal employees according to the quarterly employment survey, we've got the same number of jobs in manufacturing as we did in 2003, which is not great, obviously. There has been growth in other areas, again, in finance, insurance, real estate, and services, in trade, as in retail and wholesale trade, as well as hospitality. But again, the kind of flat, the lack of growth in manufacturing jobs is an important contextual factor. This one I'm going to skip through. This is the composition of South Africa's 2 minutes. Okay. This is the composition of South Africa's employment according to employment status. So this divides up the kind of total working age population in these different countries. So we've got South Africa, Brazil, China, Malaysia, Vietnam, and then the upper middle income countries as a whole, and then upper middle income countries excluding China. And it divides the working age population among employers, own account workers, self-employed essentially, family workers, people perhaps working in family businesses or in family plots, employees, then those who aren't employed, and then the circles are the percentage that's employed in agriculture. And here you can see the one element of the long-term structural consequences of the way that South Africa developed, the history of apartheid, the history of those kind of policies that underpinned apartheid. You can see very clearly here we've got an extremely small, again, relative to these other upper middle income countries, we've got extremely high unemployment, or the proportion of the working age population is not employed, relatively extremely high and getting worse as compared to 2000 versus 2022. So a lack of small businesses to drive the economy, and a very small proportion employed in agriculture. Whereas you can see in China in particular, very striking, in Vietnam also very striking, and then for the upper middle income country group as a whole, you can kind of see that the expansion in the employment in these economies, in the proportion of people who are employees, was partly driven by bringing people out of agriculture and into other sectors of the economy. And yeah, the kind of exceptionally difficult nature of our employment structures is something, again, worth building an understanding of as we try and understand what kinds of policies, what kind of industrial policies need to be pursued. This one I will skip, and this one I will skip, and I'll finish with this one, which is a chart from, I hope you can see it in the bottom corner, it's Chatterjee et al.'s paper from 2021. And what this represents is the share of household wealth in these various countries that is owned by the top 10% of the population in terms of their wealth. And you can see that in South Africa, it's consistently higher than all these other countries, and consistently between 80 and 90% of wealth in the economy owned by the top 10%. And then if I change it, this represents the share of wealth, household wealth owned by the top 1% as compared to these other countries. Again, exceptionally high, in this case growing, and between 50 and 60% for the last 10, 15 years or so. And this, I mean, you can understand this, I guess, as an outcome of all the things that have gone before, of having a very strange employment structure, of having a very skewed export basket, of having a manufacturing sector that's really struggled in the last 25 years. These are some of the outcomes that you get. And I think, if I may, I hope I'm summarizing their findings properly, but I think they also found that the bottom 50% of the South African kind of wealth distribution, in fact, has negative wealth. So the bottom 50% is in fact in debt, versus this exceptional concentration at the top. So I hope that's not too depressing, all of this. I'm going to run very quickly through. In fact, maybe we can come back to this in discussion later.
Take a minute.
Okay, I'll take a minute. So, I mean, on the implications, look, the kind of the parts of our economic structure that are unchanged and need changing, and the parts of our economic structure that are in fact worsening, suggest that what we've been doing for the last while hasn't worked. And I think this is something Niva will get into in more detail, but it creates a big challenge where the path you're on is not sustainable, but there are huge risks when your economy is so concentrated to disrupting what exists already. Another implication is perhaps, or an argument perhaps, is that there needs to be a more influential role for industrial policy in our broader suite of policies, and in shaping government action and resource allocation. But the fact of what's happened in our manufacturing base, the fact of this incredible inequality, the fact that socially there's a whole range of urgent priorities, combined with the kind of fiscal constraints that we find ourselves in, means that it's a very difficult situation in which industrial policy has to operate. And to build strong coalitions, you need resources to be able to put into those coalitions. It's obviously more complicated than that, but a lack of resources is a problem. And then again, something that I think Itu is going to go into in more detail, that the conditions for manufacturing-led growth, for export-led growth have become more and more difficult. And we see in the rich countries at the moment a re-emergence of industrial policy and trade policies, which makes things more difficult for us. So I'll leave it there with that question.
Thanks, Nishal. I think it provides a very good context, and you've now seen a lot of the data that really shows and where things have been going and why we need to think about this differently. I'm going to now hand over to Itumeleng Mokoena, who's going to present on the trends in the global political economy and trade.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see some familiar faces again. Yeah, can you go to the first slide, Rose? Cool. So as Sol has mentioned, so today's presentation is on the key trends in the global economy since 2008. And what I will do in this last slide is to kind of talk about what the implication might be for South Africa's industrial policy, as well as broader industrial development. So the way this presentation is structured is that we'll firstly start off with the introduction, which is a bit long, but it sets a very good context for some of the things that I might not cover in some of the key trends. And then we'll look at some of the shifts in international trade, the return of industrial policy, particularly in the global north, and a brief overview of what is happening within the global value chains. And lastly, it will be looking at the implications for South Africa's industrial policy. So the international order that emerged from 1945 faces a number of disruptions. And these disruptions are likely to reshape global trade landscape and its system of governance. Firstly, globalization, which intensified from the late 1990s and early 2000s, is showing some signs of slowing down. And what you see this in the data when you look at the trade data, which I'll touch on in the next slides, but also in investment data, you see that there's a deceleration in growth of international trade. China's own economic growth is also decelerating. With the Chinese government, I think they've set a target of about 5% growth rate for 2024. There is increasing use of industrial policy, particularly by countries in the global north. Global value chains themselves are also undergoing quite a systematic transformation, partly because of COVID, and then because of other factors such as climate change and rapid technological change. Multilateralism is also becoming more and more fragmented, and this is driven by intense competition between economic rivalries, particularly China and the US, but also it's also disrupted by the geopolitical tensions that are currently happening in the global economy. Now, these disruptions have been bubbling under the surface for a while now, but we expect that they will be intensified by the COVID-19 crisis, as well as the geopolitical tensions. As a result, we perhaps need to think about a modified industrial policy for South Africa that will firstly mitigate the emerging risk, but also capture some of the new opportunities that are emerging as a result of these shifts that are taking place. So the point of my presentation is basically to take you through some of the key trends. And I must be upfront that this is not an exhaustive list of everything that is happening within the global economy. But I've selected ones that I thought were relevant and would have a long-lasting impact on South Africa as well as the broader global economy. Some of the things at the moment are truly still very speculative. So the first thing is that when you look at the trade data, what you would notice is that there is a slowdown in growth. And this slowdown started since the financial crisis happened. So in the 1990s and early 2000s, if you look at average annual growth in global exports, they haven't been increasing by an average of about 6%. But since then, you started seeing this deceleration in growth of international trade. This becomes particularly more pronounced from 2015 to 2019, whereby growth was averaging about 2.4%, and from 2020, it was about 1.7%. And there are two primary factors that have contributed to the slowdown. Firstly, it's due to the stagnant demand from the global north. What happened after the financial crisis is that it led to the decline in income levels. That meant lower demand for consumption imports. But also after the global financial crisis, what happened was that there was a bit of uncertainty as a result of the crisis. So that led to lower investment levels, which led to lower demand for imported goods. But more importantly, something that has been happening within the global economy is that China's own growth as well is starting to show some signs of slowing down. I think in the early 2000s to about 2010, China's growth rate was averaging about 10%. And as I've mentioned, since COVID has hit, the economy has not been performing so well. And this poses a risk firstly for international trade, but also for South Africa's exports, traditional exports that we've spoken about. At the moment, I think China is one of our largest trading partners. And as Nishal has shown you, we mainly export primary commodities to China. So that is a risk to South Africa at the moment. But one thing that you would notice as well is that there's a shift in trade policy of many countries towards a bit more protectionist stance. I think the financial crisis itself was one of the first major events that has exposed the vulnerability of a highly interconnected and globalized economy. So countries have started imposing some of the tariffs, and you'll see in this next slide in terms of protectionism. So when you look at the tariff data, one thing that you would notice is that from 1994 to about 2008 or so, import tariffs have been on a downward trajectory. That means tariffs have been reducing, but they begin to level out from 2008. So between 2000 to 2009, tariffs declined for about 20%, but in the next decade, they declined for about 4%. And in 2019, the tariff rates reached their highest level, primarily driven by the US-China war. But if you look at non-tariff measures as well, they also have been increasing, particularly from 2015 to about 2022. One of the measures that has become relatively popular within trade policy is localization and some of the import restrictions that have been taking place. The next thing that I'm going to talk about is the return of industrial policy in the global north. We've seen from the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022, as well as the EU Green Deal industrial policy. So I looked at the data that has been compiled by Global Trade Alert. I think they've started compiling industrial policy measures. So just to make it clear that this data is between January 2023 to December 2023. So it's only for 2023. And what you start to see is that industrial policy has been predominantly implemented by countries in the global north. If you look at the graph on your right, what you tend to see is that United States is by far the leading country in 2023 that has used industrial policy measures. Right? It is followed by Canada and India. But the US mainly relies on subsidies for domestic producers. Similar to Canada, is also relies more on subsidies. But the picture is a bit different for emerging economies, or what they normally call developing economies. If you look at India, the picture is a little bit more varied, as well as Brazil. So they do use some subsidies, but they also rely more on import barriers. And this could be one of the reasons the research shows is that developing countries tend to rely on general trade protection measures that does not require direct expenditure from the government, whereas advanced economies mainly rely on direct financial grants in order to implement industrial policies. even if you look at the graph on your right, number of industrial policies number of new industrial policies by policy instrument. This is looking at the whole, the total number of measures that have been implemented by all countries. And you can still see subsidies is by far the leading measures that has been used. It's particularly used, as I've indicated, by advanced economies. But then the picture as of import barriers is the second largest measure that has been used. And it's mostly used in this case by developing countries. And this new industrial policy measures go beyond traditional sectors that we know and we've studied in industrial policy. So now they include advanced technology products, low carbon technology, medical products, semiconductors, as well as critical minerals. And the motivation also go beyond strategic competitiveness. Now you start seeing industrial policies being implemented for climate change mitigation, global value chain resilience, as well as geopolitical concerns. And then looking at the trends within the global value chain, what I must say upfront, this is a very hard thing to measure because there's a lot of changes that are happening, and you really can't tell at the moment where what is the future of global value chain is going to look like. But what you start seeing, if you look at the forward and backward participation, is that backward participation has been decelerating since 2008. China's backward linkage has also been decreasing, but that of its neighboring country has been increasing. This partly confirms some of the evidence that we've been seeing in the news, that there are some firms that are moving out of China into neighboring countries because of some geopolitical concerns. But I just want to touch on some of the three key trends that are happening quite briefly within the global value chains. That there isn't quite credible data at the moment, but it's something that has been mentioned a lot. So there is a bit of reshoring and nearshoring, as well as what they call friendshoring of value chains. And this is partly driven by the COVID-19 pandemic, where it exposed the vulnerabilities of far-flung supply chains. So countries are no longer considering the cost implications only, but also security of supply. So they want to create redundancies in terms of supply chains. But you also have a very rapid technological change happening within global value chains. One example is with industrial robots. More and more countries, particularly China, are adopting industrial robots in their productions. And this could, in some instances, accelerate the reshoring, because once you can effectively implement robots to take off some of the production, you cut production costs, and then you can bring back manufacturing to closer locations. But then you have other climate change policies that are taking place, particularly the CBAMs. You have the EU as well as the UK CBAMs, and I think, Knox, you're going to touch on some of the things that are happening within the climate change space. So just to conclude, so one thing about it's that these shifts that I've outlined have the potential, could potentially break the traditional model of export-oriented industrial policy, as well as this model of trying to move towards or integrating into global value chains and capture higher value add within these global value chains. As global value chains themselves expanded in the early 2000s, South Africa's industrial policy itself also shifted its focus to a certain degree and focused on capturing a higher value add within global value chains while remain export-orientated. But this model to industrial development becomes increasingly difficult. Firstly, the deceleration in trade growth is likely to dampen the growth or stunt growth in many countries, including that of South Africa. And as I've mentioned, geopolitical concerns and technological development are likely to slow down the expansion of global value chains, if not reverse the trend. But you know, as I've started looking at the emerging industrial policies, there could be a potential opportunity for South Africa's industrial policy, or for South Africa's mining sector particularly. So what happens is that with the EU Green Industrial Policy and perhaps with the semiconductors, what we could see happening would be the US and the EU demanding more of South Africa's critical minerals. That's all that I have for you today. I don't know if there are any questions, but I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Tumuling. We'll do questions at the end after we've had the input from our discussant. Thank you. It was a really useful and insightful paper, and I think it gives us a sense of what industrial policy measures advanced economies are doing. And I was really interested to see that subsidies and localization have become really important policy measures in advanced and developed countries, and something for us to think about, and how developing countries are trying to still use import measures as their main strategy. So definitely gives us a different perspective on some of the trends and what it means for competitiveness of firms and competitiveness of industry as well, and how these things are being tackled in different jurisdictions, and the implications for trade and for value chain. So thank you very much. Then our next paper is Nokwanda, who's going to be talking about the climate crisis.
Afternoon, everyone. So I think while my presentation goes up, where I would like to start is on the thought that, you know, as Itumeleng and Nishal were presenting, I was thinking about the fact that as a country, South Africa we're basically like that rich kid in school, but we're rich in the sense that we're in a rural school. So generally we're all poor, but we're rich because we have, you know, skaftini for lunch during break and stuff like that. But the base of it is that we're not as rich as we think we are. And that poses a sort of egg and chicken situation for South Africa's industrial policy, in the sense that we have so many structural problems that we must address for, right? And we sort of need industrial policy to address those structural problems. But the success of industrial policy is incumbent upon those structural problems not existing. And so which one do we solve first? And so that's where I would like to start my presentation. You can, I have a clicker. So that is where I would like to start my presentation. I don't have an outline like the other presentations, but I do have a sort of key takeaways that I would like everyone to think about as I go through the presentation. So this paper is essentially on post-COVID industrial policy and how that will be framed by the climate crisis. And so what we're seeing now is that more broadly industrial policy in South Africa, which really, and NIVA has done, I think, something on this that shows that maybe industrial policy spending has been going down over the years, but it still really is the big policy of government where this is what we're trying to do in order to achieve the economic outcomes that we want to. But in any case, industrial policy has to sort of contend with existing structural inequality on the one hand, a worsening climate crisis now, and ongoing challenges on a domestic front around, you know, load shedding, around the damage to infrastructure that we've seen. So an example would be around the rail infrastructure damage, especially since the start of COVID-19 in 2020. And so that brings us now to a point where we're sort of struggling even with our export capacity because of some of the backlogs in the ports, for example, some of the damages that have been seen in rail infrastructure. The second part of that is, unlike other countries, and I will show you the graph in the next slides, unlike the global norm, we are heavily reliant on coal. And so that has implications for the success of our industrial policy in the sense that we need to be producing, we need to be trading. But if our trade goods that we're producing are still largely based on fossil fuels, either from electricity that has been used, and more than 70% of our electricity is from coal, that will essentially increase costs for South African exports, and that will make our exports less competitive. And so in terms of the success of industrial policy, it also then depends on our ability to reduce emissions. And most of our emissions come from Eskom, Sasol, other industries, including steel, for example, and then the automotive industry, but also more broadly, the transport industry. And generally between Eskom, Sasol, and the automotive industry, these are essentially in line with some of the vision that's been expressed in the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. And so I think the last part here is that efforts to reduce emissions and efforts to make sure that the success in industrial policy also depend on getting some of those cross-cutting strategies correct, solving some of the structural problems that we have as a country. And so the nature essentially of the problem here that we're looking at in terms of the paper is, again, South Africa has to sort of improve its industrial policy in the context of climate change. And as I've said, we have many problems as a country, including high inequality, including high joblessness. And as you would have seen from, Nishal's presentation around where most of our wealth as a country comes from in terms of export earnings, for example, that's all essentially from minerals and mining, few less so income from like the auto industry and other manufacturing. But what we've seen as well, given how high inequality is in South Africa at this point, is that those rents from mining have not necessarily changed the structure of the economy. And so even with production, we're still producing, we're still exporting stuff that's linked to the mining industry. And again, that has implications in terms of the structure of our economy, as Itumeleng would have pointed out around CBAM. If we're still heavily reliant on fossil fuels, then we're going to face problems in terms of continuing to export to some of our key trade partners, especially the European Union, which receives a very big chunk of our automotive exports, for example. And it might be that other countries are also now beginning to explore sort of how to implement their own version of CBAM, but we haven't seen any progress on that so far, so we'll keep exploring it. And then just broadly for the paper, essentially we're trying to explore how industrial policy will be shaped by the climate crisis and how it will respond to it. And then I will also outline some of the actions being taken within the different industries to address the issues of climate change and reducing emissions. And then also outline some of the implications for key cross-cutting strategies like localization and infrastructure investment. So as I said earlier, this is what our dependence on coal looks like in terms of energy consumption by source. So we've seen that the share of coal consumption in energy has been going down, but that's not because the volumes are going down. It's rather because there's been some investments in different areas, including solar, for example, including growth in nuclear, some growth in gas. And we're still relatively higher than what is the global norm, which is around 30%, 25%, 30%. We are still essentially at more than 60%. And again, that has implications for how our industrial policy can respond to the issue of climate change, but also be able to meet some of its key outcomes in terms of development. So climate. I think part of the thing is that generally the impacts from climate change are going to essentially be twofold. So there's the biophysical impacts of climate change, which is, as Saul would have mentioned, the increasing frequency of storms, of droughts, and all of those things. And we have seen that those obviously have a cost. They have a health cost, they have a human cost, but they also have an economic cost. And so when you look at the numbers in terms of how much natural disasters have cost the global economy, some of the estimates are around 5.2 trillion globally. This is from the insurance group AON. And for South Africa, that's around 2.7 billion. That's just for 2021. So it would cover the Table Mountain fire, the storms that we saw in KZN, for example. And what this does essentially from the biophysical impacts of climate change is that it will require a redirection of resources from areas like industrial policy to then be responding to these increasing in frequency natural disasters. So the more storms are coming, obviously we will then need to respond to those so that people are taken care of. But what that means is that as a country, we then need to figure out how to continue funding the other key programs such as industrial policy, along with trying to do some of the social protection work to protect people who are impacted by climate change from a biophysical perspective. So the paper will obviously outline these details a bit more comprehensively than I am covering right now. And then from a policy perspective, essentially the other issue or the other sort of impact from climate change outside of the biophysical impact is around policy responses. And this does not necessarily mean just for South Africa. So obviously in South Africa, we have something such as the carbon tax, for example, and that has in a way served to internalized to the people that are doing the production, internalize some of the cost of carbon emissions. So now they're having to pay more for essentially producing goods that are very carbon intensive. Similarly, other countries have implemented this. CBAM is a very good example of that. And what that means is that South Africa's response to the climate crisis is not just about what we decide to do as a country. We will be heavily impacted by what other countries are going to be doing or are already doing. So what that means, CBAM, again, it's a big example right now. Whatever we're exporting from the automotive industry, because of its reliance on, coal-generated electricity, those are going to be more expensive. So it's going to become less competitive. Additional to that, we are still a country that exports a lot of, minerals and stuff like that. And so we will be impacted in that sense as well. And so in terms of our own responses as a country, part of it obviously comes back to we need to reduce our emissions in order to be able to circumvent some of the potential losses that will come from not having any of these responses. And as I have mentioned earlier, I mean, when you look at where our emissions are coming from, that is again Eskom, it's Sasol, it's other part of industry like steel, for example, and then it's the transport sector, which generally just means automotives. And so it requires industry to start thinking about how will they be impacted by some of these responses. Is it a matter of changing some of their technology? Is it a matter of finding alternative feedstock? Obviously for Eskom, they are already looking at renewables. An organization like Sasol, which is when we talk about petrochemicals in South Africa, we're essentially talking about Sasol. They need to then figure out what feedstock they're going to be using if the industry is going to survive. And so just in terms of some of the responses, I have already spoken to some of the stuff that's on the left. So what we've seen in terms of responses from some of the key organizations or key industries, this is a bit more comprehensive in the report itself. This is just a summary of some of the things that have been included. So as I've said, for Eskom, that includes increasing the use of renewables. One of the other targets was the decommissioning of Komati, which has already been done. And then in terms of Sasol, for example, they are looking to procure more renewable energy by 2050. And then also exploring the potential to produce green hydrogen in Sasolburg. They are also working, I'm not sure how far they are with that feasibility study. I think it might be done already in collaboration with AMSA to look at the creation of a green hydrogen hub in the Northern Cape. And then obviously changing some of their technology around fine coal briquetting and stuff like that. And then from an AMSA perspective, things are obviously changing with AMSA given their now decision on the long steel production part. But some of what they have said is essentially around increasing the use of scrap, as well as putting up renewable energy programs across their different production plants. So I think probably there might be a question out there about why not look at aluminum, why not look at other areas. But again, just for emphasis, this happened by accident. I had not seen the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. I simply looked at where the highest emissions were, and it so happened that it aligned with the investment plan, because essentially, and I will say this again, between Eskom, Sasol, and the transport sector, you've got about 80% or so of our emissions. And so significant reductions there would significantly reduce our overall emissions. And then my closing slide, Roz, it's not working again. Thank you. Okay, so this is essentially looking at the implications for cross-cutting strategies and some of the cross-cutting issues that we've been facing. So the big one, obviously, right now is the energy crisis, which means that we've seen Eskom, we've seen, businesses spend more money on diesel, on renewables where they have been able to. But what that means for Eskom as well is that whatever money they're spending on diesel, they're not spending on renewables anymore. And so addressing that issue of electricity is important for industrial policy, but also making sure that the move to renewables happens is important for South Africa's emissions reduction goals. And then on localization, I mean, this is a thing that's been ongoing for a while now, and I am happy that we've all seen that even the US implements localization, even when they don't call it that. But part of the thing around localization and how we think about greening our industrial policy is having to redesign some of the incentives that exist to support decarbonization and emissions reductions goals. And so that, I think we've also around localization, we've had these conversations around, the consolidation of projects so that we are able to reach scale if ever we are going to be manufacturing stuff locally. And in a way, we are already missing the boat. Galo has done some data analysis on that, but we've seen really rapid growth in imports of renewable equipment coming in, especially from China. And so we are already sort of missing that boat, and we need to be able to get in now to support localization, but to also support, the country's goals around this issue. And then the last big one that needs addressing as well is around infrastructure. As I said earlier, we have seen a lot of damage to infrastructure. And so we need to be addressing the backlog around infrastructure that hasn't been upgraded in a very long time. And then also using some of these infrastructure investment targets to install some of the renewable energy stuff that we're looking at, and some of the supporting local production. So charging infrastructure, for example, would be something that we could look at producing locally and then doing the sort of support long-term maintenance. Yeah, so that is essentially my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nokwanda. I think again, gives a good perspective on some of the challenges that are emerging as a result of the climate crisis and some of the responses that we required. So we're starting to see the depth of many of the changes that are facing us when we start bringing all of this together. Let me hand over now to Nevo, who's going to be presenting on the political economy context.
I should say this is very much a work in progress. So the idea is to talk about the political economy of industrial policy in South Africa. And I think as we've been hearing, the problem we're really trying to explain is we've had this industrial policy now for a long time. And yet we've seen very little structural change in the South African economy, as I think Nishal was pointing out, and other people by implication. And we already heard this, low employment, very heavy dependence on mining compared to other countries, and low levels also of tertiary education compared to other countries. Those are all just indicators of the fact that we haven't really seen the kinds of structural change we thought we would see. The budget for the DTIC is now less than 0.5% of total government spending. 10 years ago, it was closer to 1%. Before 94, I'm not even going there. But I understand it was all for sanctions busting, so we shouldn't feel too bad about it. And there has been, I think everyone would agree, a failure to ensure consistent support across the state. We've been whinging about that also for at least 10 years. So that we'll say such and such is necessary for industrial policy, like the classic one was regulations on biofuels blending, and the other departments just say won't. Yeah? And we've never managed to fix that. Not always. We don't notice it when they say yes, but we definitely notice when they say won't. Yeah? And so here the idea is to say, how do we understand this? That is from a policy-making standpoint in terms of the political economic factors, the context of institutions and power relationships in society that lead to this outcome. Because of course, you can always understand these things on different levels. You can understand it in terms of specific projects. You can understand it in terms of technical decisions, like what kinds of incentives we use, how much money we spend. Or you can understand it in terms of what led to those particular outputs that ultimately meant industrial policy has not been as effective as we would like. And so what I want to do is start by looking at 3 big industrial policy initiatives since 2019, which is the response to the pandemic, load shedding, and the master plans. And what's interesting about them is that there's a very big difference in their scale and in their approach, and that points to some systemic questions. One of which is, how do we think about setting priorities in a very divided society, where the dominant party itself is effectively a coalition and finds it very hard to agree internally? Reflecting, I would argue, the divisions in society, but that remains the fact. How do we balance demands in that context also between we have established businesses that are world-class, absolutely competitive, like we heard, especially in the mining value chain, in horticulture, to some extent in auto assembly. But industrial policy is about saying, and particularly industrial policy, if we want to overcome the employment deficit, has to be looking at more labor-intensive activities, as well as more rapid growth, or we probably won't catch up unless we get to sort of Chinese rates of growth, which seems unlikely. Yeah? A third thing is, and this I hadn't really expected, but the effect of global ideological trends also shape the kinds of things we think about. So it's definitely become easier to think about tariffs now than it was before US and Europe were doing it. And then issues around institutional and systemic path dependency. By that, I mean how we allocate resources and capacity between institutions, but also what are the decision-making systems within institutions? So when we decide about licenses, when we decide about the allocation of infrastructure, all of those issues. Obviously, there are entrenched ways of doing that. It's hard to change. Let's see if this is working. Okay, here we go. You wanna, Ozal? Thanks. Okay, so if we look at industrial policy in the pandemic, and obviously this is a high-level summary, there is a briefing note. What we did in terms of industrial policy. Firstly, we had the lockdown, but we exempted mining and agriculture primarily, and a few other things that were seen as emergency producers, like some kinds of things for the medical sector. We did introduce new occupational safety rules. that were supposed to make it easier for businesses to stay open. There was a very uneven response to business lobbying against restrictions. So for instance, the Western Cape always wanted to open up earlier, and then there would be a surge of COVID and they would have to close down, for instance, just before Christmas, which you can argue was an irrational outcome. We also got sued by alcohol and tobacco companies, who honestly, some of their arguments were very specious, if you looked at them. Second thing we did, and which was actually the biggest thing, we used the surplus on the UIF, which is still well over 100 billion rand, to provide extensive support for small formal business in order to avoid layoffs. Yeah? So they got some support that was supposed to mean instead of just firing people, they would retain people until the lockdown was over. So, you know, that actually funded after a few months, it was funding a third of all formal workers and about 2/3 of all formal businesses, most of which are small. Yeah? And we also had special funds for tourism, culture, and agriculture. Those had rather uneven outcomes. Yeah? Depending, yeah, some worked better than others. So in effect, that was very substantial support. I mean, I think it was about 60 billion. I'd have to go and check the numbers. But it was entirely off budget for small business and for formal workers. Did not reach the informal sector because they don't pay UIF by definition. Yeah? I mean, you're defined as formal if you pay UIF. We also had a new social grant for jobless adults who were in theory able to work. So this was actually quite a big conceptual shift, because in the past, it's always been we only give grants to the deserving poor, which is people who can't work. They're either too young or too old or they're disabled. So this was the first time we've had a social grant for people who in theory could work, but couldn't get a job. So that does reach the informal sector. And by mid-2020, it reached 3.5 million people. By 2023, it reached 7 million, unlike the UIF, temporary employer support. This one is still there. They tried to take it away in 2022. And a few months later, there was substantial unrest and they reinstated it. Yeah, Treasury hates it, but that's another story. And then we had, and the reason I'm putting these under industrial policy is because they clearly had industrial policy outcomes. You know, I mean, the extent to which labor policy is part of industrial policy, we can debate, but they had big impacts in terms of sustaining demand, avoiding unrest, maintaining a stable economic context. And then, of course, the more obvious pure industrial policy thing was localization, especially for medical inputs, including sanitizers, PPE, and respirators, and we laid the groundwork for localizing vaccines. And that did probably help sustain local manufacturing through the downturns. I mean, every wine producer started producing sanitizers. It was very impressive. And there were reports of waste and corruption, but to be blunt, everywhere in the world, these programs led to, you know, when government is handing out money in an emergency, there will be waste and corruption. It is built in. There's no particular evidence that we were worse than other countries. But I will say there was a lack of clarity. And again, people were operating in emergency, but we need to have that discussion about when does localization make sense? Because, you know, people put a lot of money into the vaccines and then they cost twice as much as imports. And that makes it basically not viable to sustain. You know, so how do we decide those things? Maybe we need a more careful decision, although that did have to do with the international ideology, which I will come to. Sorry, Roselle, the next one. Yeah. Oops. Yeah. If we look at load shedding as another sort of big industrial policy thing, I would say more omission than commission in this case. You know, it's been economically devastating. It was twice as high in 2023 as in 2022, and 2022 was 4 times as high as 2021. And it is a big factor behind the lagging growth that Nishal was talking about. You know, it's not the only factor, but it certainly contributed to the fact that growth in South Africa has been slower and the recovery from the lockdown has been slower in South Africa than in peer economies, other upper middle income countries. The official strategy has tended to say, let's fix the national grid. What they haven't done is provide much support for small businesses or households in order to mitigate that impact or to help them go off the grid. And there's been big delays also in terms of supporting particularly off-grid generation, whether at the household or the business level or to supply the grid itself. Progress has been Load shedding is down, but I mean, ESCOM generation is now 25% below what it was in 2010, which is a terrifying thought. And that's mostly because of the delays in Medupi and Kusile. So they, of course, blame everybody else, but the real thing is Medupi and Kusile were supposed to come online 5 to 7 years ago. Meanwhile, their other plants are aging out and being run too hard. Bigger projects like the Renewable Energy Independent Producer Program, I think there's another P in there. They basically stalled. So we've had so far 560 megawatts by the end of 2023 from those. Now, theoretically, we will be getting gigawatts fairly soon. They have at least issued the contract. But those things take a year or two generally to come online. And then there's the transmission. In contrast, rooftop solar has gone up from 1 gigawatt in 2020 to over 5 gigawatts in 2023, which is around 15% of demand, which proves what you can do if you have highly unequal countries and people with money and established formal businesses who can afford to get the financing to install the thing. Yeah? But it is impressive that it's gone much faster than the bigger centralized programs. What the incentives were, okay, Treasury's provided almost 10 billion a year in tax incentives for off-grid solar starting last year. So they basically rolled the tax incentive over this year. But to be fair, that only really benefits high-income households and formal business because it's a tax incentive. So people who don't pay income tax, which is like 80% of the population, and obviously informal businesses, are not going to get an incentive. The other thing is you still need to have financing for the rest of it. If you've ever done solar, you know that there's a very big upfront cost and you need to finance it. So again, only people who already have access to resources can even get into that. So it's been very skewed. You know, if you look at it by income level, the share of households with, according to the stats that say, the share of low-income households with solar has remained almost unchanged in the past 5 years. Yeah? The DTIC has also tried to address regulatory obstacles to businesses building off-grid solar. They've also dispersed 100 million to help build formal business resilience, that is to go off-grid or reduce energy intensity, although they've approved 1.6 billion. And if you know how these things work, who knows when that will actually get paid out at that point. And they say they have facilitated 2.2 gigawatts of off-grid power, but they don't really say what they mean by facilitated. And I haven't had time to ask them. No? Roselle, the next one. Okay, third case study is the master plan. So the original proposal was from something called the Reimagined Industrial Policy, which was never issued as a formal policy. But I have read several different, I mean, there have been several different presentations on it, internal and external. So the key proposal was we should have well-defined aims for industrial policy. On that basis, we should prioritize the industries that will help us scale up support. There should be closer collaboration with industry stakeholders. So we need to set up platforms at industry level to enable engagement. And in fact, it was quite clear that was seen as the more important than the published actual plan document, was setting up that platform to improve communication. There should be an evidence-based approach where we look at things and try and come up with solutions that are realistic. And there should be increased resourcing and alignment across the state. So a central part of this was that it shouldn't, industrial policy should not just be a DTIC policy, it should be a national policy. So in practice, we have 11 published master plans as of the end of 2023 and innumerable ones more or less in process. But the aims are really unclear. In particular, are we trying to promote new kinds of activity that can create employment and support small businesses where we have those deficits Nishal was talking about? Or do we want to help establish business and just help them get through crises, help them expand marginally by improving government services in particular? And you need to do both, obviously, but what comes out is there's been a focus on, in the master plans, are all really centered on, in practice, how do we support established businesses? The industries chosen are quite peculiar, okay? So it's very hard to see a clear priority. So we have industries there that are, 0.5% of manufacturing. We have poultry. We have one for agriculture, but we also have one for poultry, which is actually tiny. No? I don't know if anybody's here from the poultry industry, but that's a fact. We have one for sugar, which is even tinier. Anyways, And at the same time, we don't have one for chemicals or for capital goods or for just about any services, except for cultural services. And the quality also is very different. And now they're really going into more, say, niche products like cannabis, medical instruments. Yeah, there are a few others that people are really pushing, where it's really hard to say this will be transformative in the economy. So if the aim is to say what are our priorities that are transformative, what we've really seen is industries that were in crisis or where government already had capacity, even though it's not a very big industry. And that's where we've seen the master plans actually get published. Government, it seems like given the lack of clear outcomes, Tanya, you can speak to this. People really, like government negotiators were saying what we need to do, we need to get some targets for kind of incremental growth in investment in jobs and outcome, and for Black ownership. The agreement seemed to be driven, I'm sorry, I have 2 minutes, so I'm going to talk even faster. The agreement seemed to be driven by established business, and that means there's been a very heavy emphasis on protection and localization, not so much emphasis on cutting costs. There's been almost no new product lines or producers, which would lead to a qualitative step up in employment. And I have to say, some of the measures really, you could see who was in the room and who wasn't. So when they put a high tariff on chicken, which is a staple food for the poor, you really have to wonder if that's the best use of government industrial policy. What was also interesting was they didn't set up new systems to obtain or use evidence to promote alignment across the state or to scale up resourcing. So a core idea in the original thing was, we'll have the alignment, we'll have scaled up resourcing, so we'll have a real impact. They didn't set up any new systems to do that. Yeah? And finally, what you can see is if you add them all together, basically the industries, even if they succeed, the targets are so modest, the industries are so small, that you actually get like 0.3% increase in growth, even if they succeeded, and an even smaller increase in employment. Okay, so why? Like I said, international paradigms. The pandemic was more radical and bigger because everybody was doing it. That makes it easier for people in our government also to say we can take these risks, because it becomes a hegemonic idea about what we can do. Whereas with load shedding and industrial policy, we don't have anybody to copy, and people become very risk averse, right? They feel like nobody else is doing anything radical around electricity. Nobody's doing anything radical around industrial policy, like requiring, to create jobs and support small business. So we'll just, it becomes very hard to say we will take those risks, because we can't say, well, look, they're doing it in the UK and the US, so it's all right. There are contested aims. Should we do reconstruction or modernization? As we've said, we have a very different structure from East Asia, but we're still thinking somehow we're going to get there by modernization, by upgrading efficiency and becoming more competitive. By definition, you're not going to create a lot of jobs that way unless demand was going through the roof. But as we've seen, international trade is basically flat. So we're not going to likely to get that increase in demand internationally. And we're in a low-income region. And you can understand this in terms of intensive versus extensive growth, but I'm too far over time, so I'm not going to go there. But yeah. You also have the issues of power that, who has voice in these decisions? During the pandemic, it was seen as a crisis on the one hand, and on the other hand, the people who were having to pay more was taxpayers and importers. And by the way, the UIF financial managers who lobbied very hard against the UIF program, because it was clearly going to cut into their fees if the surplus was reduced. But in a democracy, the real problem is, and I think Michelle said this, we have a democratic system with economic concentration. It's very hard to see a sustainable industrial policy unless you can somehow ensure that the majority benefit. And we just haven't seen that for most of these measures. It was very clear under COVID. With the other ones, it's harder for people to see. So in terms of decision-making systems, sorry, this should have all come up as a block. So yeah, messed up the animation. On the one hand, like we said, you've got conflict between political and economic constituencies and those divisions are reflected in the ruling party. And by the way, a coalition will likely be worse. So you end up with real compromises and more chances for patronage and so on when you have coalitions. We inherited very top-down governance structures and we haven't really changed them. So our departments say we're going to do service delivery. They don't say, how do we mobilize communities? and individuals to have agency. We don't have conflict resolution systems within the state. So like you come back to after you've been away for 10 years and we're having the same damn fights we had 10 years ago. And that of course favors the status quo because it makes it hard to push through action. And then finally, like I said, the consultative structures we have tended to empower established businesses in most cases. I mean, the pandemic was different because it was empowering the scientists to a significant extent. And then in that context, Treasury and them were more open to, international trends that were relatively radical. So last slide, Saul, sorry. So what are the implications? Firstly, as we keep saying, how do we think about a coalition of support for industrial policy that is both core players in the economy, but also core political constituencies? And that means I think we have to think more about the concerns of the historically excluded rather than just focusing on modernization and assuming trickle down. In other words, we need to be more explicit about the relative benefits for political stakeholders as well as economic stakeholders, which means we need to say, what will it do for established business? What will it do for emerging business, for workers, for jobless people, for working class communities? How do you then think about measures that are both politically and socially as well as economically viable? We have to improve risk management. So a lot of the reason officials are risk averse is because you get hammered if something goes wrong. But if it goes right, it's taken for granted. Or if you're doing something that's been going on forever and has never worked, that's fine too. But if you do something innovative, somebody will come and scream at you, right? So we need to say, what does a risk management system look like? And we have to manage the costs so that we reduce political and social opposition. In other words, we need things like the just transition, which says where this policy will have a negative impact on people. How do we think about managing that rather than just pushing it through or just doing nothing? And then finally, I think we need to rethink all the systems of the state so we get a better balance between supporting established business and promoting new activities that can create employment. We have to support mobilization and agency as part of industrial policy rather than saying, we will give you money, we will give you skills, we will give you this. But how do you think about mobilization? And we really need to say, we need to get better alignment within the state, which means discussing policies better before we adopt them. But it also means having dispute settlement systems. So you don't sit there and cluster, and we're still talking about bloody set-top boxes, which I used to walk out at that point. Okay.
Thank you, Niba. Implementing industrial policy is not easy, as you've highlighted. Thank you. Tanya, over to you for your inputs as discussant.
So thanks to everybody who's presented. The papers have been fascinating. It's quite difficult to try and refine what I'm going to respond to given the limited time. So I'm going to respond in 3 key areas. The first is the papers have looked at economic, social, political trends and then said, how is that impacting industrial policy? The one question we haven't asked ourselves, and which is key to industrial policy, is what is our vision of the future? What is the vision of the economy that we want to have? So, for example, we can say, well, we might not be able to export markets are closing, there's a rise in protectionism. But are we saying we want to keep developing companies that are going to export? In which case, the answer is then to look at how you deal with protectionism, how you deal with competitiveness. Or, for example, we say the high levels of concentration. Well, do we want some very big, very successful companies that maybe have greater linkages into local economies? Or are we saying we want to stimulate SMME development? And with that, then you don't get the same quality of jobs as the large formal businesses. And there's more instability in terms of how long they last or not. Now, of course, everyone will say, well, it's a bit of everything. It's not like you choose a highly concentrated sector or you choose to have SMMEs. It's the balance. But at this point, we're trying to work out where we want to go or what we're going to do, where we don't have enough specificity on exactly what we're dealing with, because it will change from case to case. It's based on the evidence that's found. So, for example, in terms of our vision, do we want a large AMSA, a large steel producer? Or, and it could be and, do we want a stronger metals downstream sector? Would we be developing more businesses and more jobs downstream if we had lower cost inputs and just imported? Or are we saying it's important for our own security and security of supply to have the AMSA? Now, as much as we can say, you know, it's a balance, we look at the specific situation. It also requires very key choices in industrial policy, because we've got limited resources. If we're looking at the state and how much the state is going to be able to give in terms of financing or adjustment costs, well, if we're going to make that money available, where are we taking the money from? And that's where it comes down to very sharp choices. We need to be able to say what it is that we want. So as much as I take Neva's point about there are contestations, and we know that, but where are we putting ourselves in that contestation? So that's the one question. In terms of our vision, which nobody's picked up on, is the potential impact or opportunities from the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Because as much as the traditional economies and building our global regional supply chains in the region mean. So that's part of the vision. The second thing that I think we need to be able to do very strongly is prioritize what the key things are that we have to fix. So as I was talking about what we're prioritizing, and I'm suggesting we prioritize electricity transport. The third area I'd say is municipal services. And the fourth area is making sure that the support measures we put in place can be put in place quickly and effectively. So, for example, it doesn't help to have a temporary employment relief scheme, even if we want to use it to help with a just transition, whatever it is, if it takes 18 months to try and get the money, and then you may not get the money anyway. Unless the support provided by government is quickly and efficiently reaching the people it needs to reach, it doesn't help. It doesn't help to raise tariffs in a certain place if by the time the decision is taken and published, if that's a year or 2 years later from application, well, the company may have gone under or decided to close. And then, sorry, the fifth area we need to look at is the feedstocks. So, and how those feedstocks are working. So, for example, what's happening to gas and the energy intensive industrial users? Are they going to have sufficient gas to keep moving in the future? Where are we looking at coal? Who's capturing the rents for coal? What does the price of coal mean for our pricing of electricity? And how can we intervene there? And then lastly, when we're prioritizing, and it links to the vision, how are we going to fix the things that I've identified, and how does that link to vision? So, for example, if we look at electricity, we look at solar rooftops and the rise of solar and what they've brought to the grid. But does that mean that we're going to be looking to the private sector more and more for funding, and let the private sector start doing more work in the ports and commercializing areas of the ports? Or do we want to keep it in state hands? And as much as it can be an ideological debate, the question is, where is the money? And what are we going to do? Because if we let the private sector do certain things, are we going to be able to regulate them and control them effectively? So those questions around prioritization. The last area that I want to speak to, but Neva spoke to it quite a bit, was political economy. The key thing that I would ask is, where is the money going now? So coal rents. South Africa Inc. isn't benefiting. coal companies are getting money. If we're looking at protectionism, who are we protecting? We're protecting the established players who are able to go and make submissions into RTAC, for an example, or are we protecting the downstream players? As much as we can say the large companies get, muscle in the master plans, in tariffs, in a range of sectors, what are we doing to fix it? What are we doing to make sure that workers' voices are heard? What are we doing to make sure that people who we want to enter the economy, to make sure their voices are heard? We can change political economy. And then in terms of political economy as well, with large businesses, are we being effective enough in controlling their behavior? So for example, where there's collusion on large tenders, what's happening to the guys? Are the fines that are being paid sufficient? I would argue not, because that kind of behavior continues to happen. But I'd also ask then, a key root cause of where some of the large problems in the economy are, is the result of state capture. And we can see where money has been siphoned off and the impact that has had on infrastructure, investments, and services. We haven't discussed it here, but is state capture actually over? Are those deep, corrupt linkages into companies gone? I don't think so. So how then are we going to drive an industrial policy where in fact money is still being taken out of the system, tenders are still being given where they maybe shouldn't be given? And I think that's also a priority we need to fix.
Thank you very much. Really useful comments, and I think help frame the discussion and help us think about what does all of this mean and where we're going. So thank you. That really helps us framing the discussion. Let's open it up. I see there's some comments online, but let's take some hands in the room and then we'll move to hands online and then we'll open up to what's in the chat. In the room, if you can introduce yourself, people who are in the room, if there are any hands. Okay, there's a hand over here.
Thanks. Sorry, I wanted to maybe let the guys online go first, but it's fine. Thanks everyone for these really, really sound presentations. The thing about coming to TIPS is that it's really intellectually stimulating, also frustrating all at the same time, because now you realize just how much trouble we're really in. I wanted to say overall that there's a lot of, there's like a dissonance between what's happening in various sectors in this country's economy right now, frighteningly so. Because every year we have these fantastic and presidential investment summits, and it's like no two people are saying the same thing in different departments of the same government of the same country. I think that we've got a huge problem with the climate change migration with the renewables market. I'm not too sure that everyone is on board with JET. And when I say everyone, I mean government departments now. I'm not talking private sector, because that's also a completely different issue at hand, where the private sector is completely doing its own thing. I'm not sure what legislation they're complying with. I'm not sure what funding models they're employing. I'm not sure how that feeds back into economic growth. I don't know. I think that I want to talk to Neva. Sorry, also, I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Nishal. Yeah, Nishal, you said something really interesting about we're very much a high commodity intensive economy, and we're going to continue to be. And I feel that with the migration issue as well, I'm not seeing a slowdown in demand from international markets for these commodities as well. And on a policy level for them, they're being clamped down quite heavily for taxation, specifically in the global north, which to my understanding is our largest demand area, I suppose, for these commodities. So I don't know if these two industries, what's going to happen here, because just shutting down the mines isn't an option that we have readily available to us. So I'm not sure what we're going to do there. Nether, I wanted to say to you, we're not having, there's no structure, and also to Tanya, we just don't have structural changes in this country's economy. You know, the wonderful BE, Black industrialists, the billionaire class the president is very much a part and parcel of, is not delivering any dividends for poverty and for, again, that seismic structural change that we need in the country. When you said that the idea of coalitions will be worse in terms of frustrating to what I'm hearing you say, the current economic conditions, yes and no. I think it's what you opened your presentation with, which is that we need to agree on setting priorities amongst different political ideologies. And for me, it's unemployment, it's jobs, and it's going to be, I don't know, I suppose gender parity within those two arenas. One thing I didn't hear a lot of people talk about here, sorry.
Okay, thanks. You can pick up the discussion afterwards, but I think you've covered a lot of ground. Are there any other questions in the room? I see there are 2 hands online. Let's take online hands. If we can, sorry, you didn't introduce yourself.
Sorry, I'm Lerato. I'm from UJ.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, Rod, go for it.
Thanks very much, Saul, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rod Thompson. I'm with the African Energy Leadership Center at the Business School. 2 comments. Firstly, Geneva, I agree with almost everything you said, but I want to focus in on one element you touched on, which is the tax incentive for rooftop solar. So if you take let's say a solar and battery installation in an upper class household as a commercial enterprise, it's a loss-making enterprise. And most of these investments are not financially viable. They're made for non-financial reasons. But if you look at the contribution that those rooftop solars have made to reducing load shedding and the benefit to the economy as a result of reduced load shedding, there's another way to think about this, that rather than only the upper classes and the rich benefiting, that actually they are cross-subsidizing the rest of the economy in terms of providing electricity way below its actual commercial cost. And even if it hasn't eradicated load shedding completely, it's made a huge contribution. So just another way to suggesting you think about this. And I think if you do the research, you'll probably find that the tax incentive that was offered is almost irrelevant to those solar panel investments and hardly made any real contribution. That's my hypothesis for testing. The second comment is not to Niva, it's to the entire discussion. I mean, if we're going to talk about industrial policy, industrial strategy, the very notion of it is premised on a competent state that is capable of conducting industrial strategy or industrial policy. And of course, that raises the big question as to whether that applies in the South African situation and whether this whole debate on industrial policy isn't somewhat premature given the current capabilities of the state. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Rod. Rod didn't introduce himself, but he's from the Wits Energy Center. We know him well. Let's move across to Simamkele, if you want to introduce yourself and give your insights.
Thank you, colleagues. Good afternoon, colleagues. My name is Simamkele Matlagwana. I work for the Department of Economic Development Northwest. Initially, I had 5 questions, but due to the question of other speakers, I have reduced my question to 3. And it's just for clarity-seeking questions. On the first speaker, I forget the name of the gentleman. I just want to check something to say around the issue that he presented in terms of deindustrialization, where everything was going down in the country. I wanted to check whether, is it a question of bad policy implementation, or both? Or alternatively, could it be that the industrial policy that we have is good and it was implemented well, but the space at which it's operating is bad? So I wanted the speaker to check on that. The second question is regards to UAusi Nozuko. I think she was presenting on the issue of climate crisis. The presentation was titled Climate Crisis, but if you look at the content of the presentation, it used the word climate change. So I want to check with her because she argues in her paper to say that industrial policy must contend. First, she says that we must contend with climate crisis. Then later on, she changed to climate change. So I wanted to check with her what is the significance of that. Whether there is a difference, into those two terms, crisis, because scholars will argue and say there is a difference between and a response. The last question that I wanted to check with her is on the issue of, I think she mentioned on the implication side, where she says, or she argues that there's an ongoing energy crisis. Dr. Rod Crompton, I don't think he will agree with that notion that South Africa is facing energy crisis, but he might be tempted to agree with the argument that says that South Africa does not have an energy crisis, but it has an electricity crisis. I just wanted to check with her, and I wanted to contend on those words. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's get the panel to respond to those three sets of comments and questions. And then if we do have time, we can start looking in the chat. But let's start with Nishal, who was our first presenter.
First question from the technical points of dependence and individual trends. So it's not necessarily that we're commodity dependent now. We always will be, because and the reason I'm saying that is because the demand for coal is uncertain. It's probably heading down, and that's a good thing from a planetary perspective, I suppose. Maybe not necessarily so good for certain regions, although lots of debate about that too. Regions in South Africa, I mean. Things like platinum, I mean, the application in internal combustion engines, there won't necessarily be the same demand for platinum going forward. And I mean, there may be new applications, there may be a role, for research and development to find new applications for the commodities we export. But in general, and besides all of these kind of factors, and this applies more generally to the iron ore, to the manganese, all the other mineral exports that we dig up, is they're going to run out at some point. So we need to, I don't have a clear sense of or what the analysis is on how much of each of our resources that we export are left, but we need to be, we need to have it in our mind that if we don't diversify, sooner or later, we're going to have to rely on something else for export revenue, which is important for our development in the longer term. To Rod, I think on the premise of industrial policy being state capability, this is a very contested question, which maybe there's not so much time to go into in depth. But what I would say is that, at least the way I think about state capability or firm capability, or in general, the concept of capability, it's not necessarily something I think that you have or you don't have. It's something that is built and sustained and can be built up. So I mean, I agree that we're not perhaps in the fortunate position that some other developing countries are, where it seems like their states are in a better state. But that's not it's not something essential to South Africa. It can be changed, and that's part of the task ahead of us. And then on the last question about manufacturing, the decline in manufacturing, is it bad policy or what's the situation? I mean, I think it was a very difficult, I think manufacturing all over the world, I mean, in many countries, in most countries, I think has declined, and China and other large developing countries have been growing their share, and that has to come, or it comes at someone's expense. And that's been part of our story. I mean, our labor intensive industries have declined massively through having to compete with countries with bigger markets, more extensive support, lower cost structures in various ways, more advantageous location with markets, perhaps. And so it's a bit of kind of a bit of bad luck, I think, and a bit of just being outcompeted. And then, but on the policy side, something that maybe is worth saying is that after 94, when we kind of opened up our economy to imports, maybe that happened too fast, and maybe that could have happened in a way that was more structured. And by structured, I mean more supported by a more ambitious industrial policy. Perhaps, for example, our clothing industry may not have declined so rapidly had there been more resources and more capability in that area of policy.
Thanks very much. Let's hand over to Itumeleng. Sorry, if there's any responses for you, and then we'll go to Nokwanda, Neva, and then Tanya to wrap up.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm gonna have two responses, one to Lerato, but one something that Tanya also mentioned, and it could tie to Rod's question. So the issue of non-alignment or dissonance in the state where people are talking about different things, and Neva has mentioned this, is that industrial policy shouldn't be something that is only done by the DTIC. It should be done perhaps by wider government departments, starting with the presidency. We still don't have an overarching vision for industrial policy. And what we've seen from the broader government department is more of a reaction to COVID-19, the electricity crisis, and the transition. That's a bit more reactive, and we haven't started thinking about being active in pursuing a vision. And when it comes to which sectors should we perhaps prioritize, I would almost want to argue that it should be guided by our greatest challenges. So looking at our unemployment crisis, looking at inequality, those are the sectors that have the greatest impact in resolving those challenges, should perhaps be the one that are prioritized. And lastly, perhaps if we have this this top-down approach when it comes to industrial policy, we could see some of the perceived state incapability disappearing, because sometimes the capability comes from people saying different things and not being aligned. So that's my response.
Thanks. Nokwanda?
Sure, thanks. So on the question of climate crisis, climate change, it's the same thing. Potato, I mean, similarly, energy crisis, electricity crisis, I think perhaps let's not get bogged down on what terms people are using. It's a distraction from the actual conversation. And so in this sense, I mean, to go back to part of what Lerato was asking, in terms of some of the interlinkages around what Nishal was presenting and what I was presenting, I would say that perhaps as a country, we need a strategic planning session. Just close down everything. Let's go back to Zoom, have our meetings on Zoom as a country, figure out what we're trying to do, right? Because I think part of the dissonance that's happening right now has implications for the kinds of conversations we have as South Africans. And on the issue of coal, for example, where we're not sure whether we're on this just transition wagon or we're not, especially when Minister Mantashe was still talking about, clean coal and all that stuff. What that does is essentially take the conversation back. So now we're back to arguing about whether coal is clean or not, instead of having a conversation about how to integrate the planning that's happening across different departments so that we have proper plans about how to achieve the just transition we're seeking to implement. Similarly with the JET IP, honestly, it's a vision document, right? Obviously still need to sort out some of the funding issues, but I think where it is important is where it sort of directs the vision of one industrial policy as it is linked to decarbonizing the heavily carbonized sectors right now. So electricity generation, for example, it's very clear on the fact that we need to move to renewables. I think the question of funding is a big one that needs to be addressed further, but it's also very clear on the interlinkages that exist within so like the energy sector, as well as well, they're looking at green hydrogen now, but that's as a feedstock for petrochemicals, for example, as technology that can be used across industries like steel. And then there's the new energy vehicles, which also feed into that. And so I think when we read that document and when we look at the research that we're presenting, part of it is understanding some of those linkages. And then again, maybe let's have a strategic planning session about where to start. What do we need to start with? But again, I think sometimes when you spend time arguing about some of the terms, then we're distracting from the broader conversation that we should be having. I'm not sure if there's a question that I missed, but yeah.
That's fine. Neva?
Yeah, I'm also going to try and summarize because several of these questions are related. Having 4 people really means we can do answers forever. Yeah, so I'm going to start with the incompetent state and work backwards, because I think that is a critical question. I think we all feel that way, but I think that it's important to be clear that it's easy to say incompetent state, but really what we have is an inappropriate state. And we have inherited structures that were designed to maintain a very unequal status quo, and we didn't really change them very fundamentally. And then we wonder why they don't function. So I could argue the state actually has priorities, and those priorities are: we want to maintain world-class centers in the economy and in services that actually historically have served only relatively privileged people. At the same time, we want to desegregate them, which is the BE story. And at the same time, we want to extend services to the majority at some level, although not at that world-class level you have elsewhere. And so, this is, by the way, a classic post-colonial response that you see everywhere in Africa, because what you have is, in those circumstances, what you do is you reduce maintenance on those world-class centers in order to be able to extend services, and because you can do that for a few years, and then things do start to collapse, which is what we've seen with infrastructure. In the economic side, like I said, I think it's much more straightforward. We've put much more effort into supporting existing industries than we have into supporting new ones. And BE in that context is the easy way to, if white business, to be blunt, had opened the doors to young Black people with degrees, we wouldn't need BEE. But in effect, you have a very unequal society where the rewards of success are huge, of course. And if the market won't serve people, and it never, the market is not good at bringing about structural change, which is why we talk about industrial policy, then people will go to the state. And if the state doesn't do it openly, it will do it through corruption. This is true everywhere in the world. And I would argue on the political economy side, that's because since from 1994 until very recently, the ANC could take the voters for granted. So they were busy trying to reassure people they saw that they needed for society and the economy to function, who were historically privileged. And I'm not saying we don't need them. I'm just saying they took everybody else for granted. Now you're coming to a point where people are saying that's not adequate. And so you have the classic case of a dominant party that is losing power. And I'm not a political scientist, but that's what they tell me. If there are any political scientists in the room, I apologize. I do think from an economic standpoint, really what we can say is of course, problem why we haven't seen structural changes. We tend to focus on, as they say, intensive growth, where you're trying to go through increased efficiency. At the same time, we have mass joblessness. And what we need to say is, what would it look like to do extensive growth where you are producing with more people involved and more resources involved at some level? And that's really hard to think about when you've always said, well, the point of industrial policy is to increase our efficiency. But that means we tend to say, well, where are we world-class already? How do we sustain and strengthen that? As opposed to how do we develop things that meet national and possibly regional needs, maybe require a subsidy, but are doing things that add social capital or human capital, but that are maybe never going to be, adopt world-class technologies and be globally competitive. And so I'm almost done. That means we really need to be innovative about how do we identify and support labor-intensive activities, and that actually means more services as well as light industry and farming. That there's a thing in industrial policy, people don't like services, but in the modern world, that's where the employment is. Even in China, the bulk of new employment is in services. So if we're serious about job creation through the economy, then we have to look at services. What would that look like? The other thing, though, is to say, how do we get productive competencies and access to markets to more people? That means assets and skills and systems, supportive systems and networks, as well as market access. And that requires sort of, again, innovation in terms of the kinds of producers we support. Yes, formal businesses in labor-intensive sectors, but also the township economy, community works, focus on services in the public as well as the private sector. I think we need, some of the biggest industries in the economy, health and education. We never even dream about what would that look like to have a policy for them, and so on.
Okay. Tanya, any last words as the discussant? You've got the opportunity to wrap up.
Thanks. I think the papers have a limelight, but the one thing I just wanted to raise in terms of having a competent state, there are areas of absolute excellence in the state with people who are so bright, committed, work hard, they're shining examples. And then there are other areas where they burn out. There are other areas where capacity needs to be improved. But I think the question is we've got industrial policy, whether we've got a competent state or not, it's taking place every single day. So the key question for me would be, how do we use industrial policy to strengthen the competency of the state? That's the challenge I would put forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We've come to the end of our dialogue. I see there was lots of chat happening in the group chat online, and some really interesting comments came through. We unfortunately have come to the end of our discussion, but I see there was dialogue and responses along the way there. People can also, some of them can contact us directly if they have questions. The aim of our dialogue today was to promote discussion about how industrial policy has to evolve to address the new realities. I think we've done a lot of that. It's food for thought, and I think it takes us forward in terms of where we need to head to in terms of our future industrial policy. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to our presenters, and thank you for everyone for participating online and in person. Thanks.